Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This session is called Balancing Our Criminal Justice System from Reform Prosecutors to Public Defender Judges. And I can say I'm super excited about it. So we're going to be talking today about what the future of the judiciary really looks like. As many who are here may know, the movement to elect reform prosecutors has kind of changed the way that a lot of people perceive prosecution, and it, is helping reshape our criminal justice system, not on its own, but is having an impact. But we know that these efforts will not really be fully realized unless we also bring balance to our courtrooms and to the bench. So our judiciary has a stark overrepresentation of judges who were former prosecutors and corporate lawyers. And at the federal level, Trump made that imbalance even worse, picking 10 times as many former prosecutors as former public defenders and criminal defense attorneys. But now President Biden is committed to bringing greater balance and already has nominated a record number of public defenders to serve as judges. So we have a really incredible panel here. Our plan is to let District Attorney Krasner, who is joining us from his son's wedding in California, so very kind of you to take the time to join us. And we're going to let him take a second and speak. I'll introduce him, he'll speak, and then we'll move on to the rest of the panel and introduce everybody else. Does that sound good? Okay, so I'm going to introduce you, District Attorney Krasner, and then we will give you the floor. Larry Krasner was officially sworn in on January 2nd, 2017 as the City of Philadelphia's 26th District Attorney. Before being elected District Attorney, he was a public defender in Philadelphia, a federal public defender in Philadelphia before starting his own private practice, specializing in criminal defense and police misconduct matters. He has remained in private practice ever since, and during that time, he tried thousands of bench and jury trials in criminal and civil court in the Philadelphia area, as well as other counties and states. He was here, he might be gone now. Are you still here? There you are. Okay, so District Attorney Krasner, I'll give you the floor, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. You should know it is a slight exaggeration that I'm at my son's wedding. I will actually dress up for my son's wedding, but I am in California, and that wedding is imminent, and I am nonetheless delighted to have the chance to speak to all of you about what I think is something that's sort of intuitive, but also really important. So for 30 years before becoming the DA in Philly, and that was about 4 years ago, I was a criminal defense attorney, and 5 of those years I spent as a public defender. I was 3 years a public defender in Philadelphia County, and for about 2 years I was a federal public defender. I've continued to do similar work the next 25 years with my own practice. And while that was going on, my wife actually became a judge in Philadelphia County, judge of the highest trial court, where she heard a bunch of criminal cases, a bunch of civil cases, and she came to that job from having been a civil rights attorney, more specifically an employment discrimination civil rights attorney, whose clients were, in so many different categories, but they were basically from marginalized groups who were not being treated fairly and properly. A lot of them had disabilities. They were Black, they were brown, they were broke, they were mistreated, and she became an amazing judge. And so I am here both as an observer of what 19 years on the bench looks like for an outsider candidate who beat the party back and then became a judge, but also as a DA who was an ex-public defender and an outsider candidate who beat a centrist party machine back. I am here to say that it is extremely important that we have public defenders attempting and succeeding in becoming judges. Now, why? So here's the ugly part. I got to tell you the truth. There is actually nothing about being a public defender that guarantees that you're always going to do the right thing. Some of our greatest judges in history have actually been, strangely enough, ex-prosecutors. Sonia Sotomayor, for example, and Earl Warren, for example. So it is not the case that public defenders are always going to do the right thing any more than electing Black and brown people or women means they're always going to do the right thing. Stereotypes fail us, and they fail us in all directions. But it is the case that when you have public defenders who get on the bench, they are coming with a different view and a different understanding of what's going on. They know to look for different issues. They are not as inclined simply to trust what law enforcement is saying. They have insight. And so, in terms of the quality of the judging, it would be a tremendous improvement in our bench to have more ex-civil rights lawyers, more public defenders on the bench. And that would go a couple directions, in my opinion. Now, here we're not dealing with data, we're dealing with opinion, but I'll give it to you because I was in court 4 to 5 days a week for 30 years before I ended up mostly in an office as the DA in Philly. And one of the things that I saw is that my ex-colleagues who were public defenders in Philly who became judges not only had the qualities that I mentioned, the ability to really look through witnesses who were untruthful, to look through police conduct that was unlawful and call it what it was, but they also sometimes had a much more careful assessment of a defendant. They could look at a person's criminal record, they could look at psychological reports, they could look at other biographical aspects of that person, and they could differentiate between people who were deserving of that second and third chance and people, people who were driven, let's say, by unaddressed addiction issues, trauma issues, mental health issues. They could spot that as opposed to people who were really dangerous and were really harmful to others and had a pattern that didn't seem to be something easily addressed. I think that, I know that some of this is not exactly simple for all of you to digest. There are certainly people who have a more straightforward view of all this. But I'm telling you what I believe. And what I believe after watching it and being part of it for 30 years is that the biggest hurdle that we have to the improvement of the judiciary, to a judiciary becoming more progressive, is the fear of people who are public defenders, the fear that they have of running, of participating in essentially a government that they have railed against in their own ways. I think in general, what you have with public defenders is a group of people, and I was one, and so is one of my first assistants, and so was my other first assistant. I think in general, what you have is people who are pretty idealistic. They're pretty selfless. They haven't spent all of their lives whistling "Hail to the Chief" while they look in the mirror, as most politicians have. They haven't really studied politics, and they figure they cannot crack the code. They figure they cannot run. Well, my friends at Netroots, bullshit. Yes, you can. You absolutely can crack the code. I've written about this. I've spoken about this. Some of this is just lessons that were learned over 20 years, watching my wife run twice and win as an insurgent candidate at a time when a big city ward politics and a centrist party were very strong. But it's also my own experience helping other people become judges who I thought would be good as a sort of a side hobby, one of my many side hobbies while I was an attorney. It's also my run itself, which confirmed certain things. And so I am here to say that if you know someone who really should run, then you need to go tell them, because they probably don't know it. They probably haven't thought of themselves that way. They probably haven't thought of judges as being what they would like judges to be. They're so used to the word judge signifying something that was disappointing, or that was, partial justice as opposed to whole justice. You need to go get those people who are selfless and are idealistic and would make great judges, and you need to grab them by the lapels and say, do it, and I will help you do it. And if you end up grabbing your own lapels, so be it. And then you need to reach out to some of us, and if you're in Philly, reach out to me, but you need to reach out to some of us who are there to support this. It is arguably the case that the movement which I serve, and that is a movement for criminal justice reform and prosecution, that grassroots movement is looking for a different institutional partner. And one of the most likely institutional partners is going to be the judiciary. When you get to the point where you have infiltration of the judiciary with more and more progressive people, more and more people coming from a public defender and a civil rights background. When you get to that point, the work for progressive prosecutors in carrying out this mission's goals will be so much easier. It is not likely that police departments are going to be our next natural ally, but it is likely that the judiciary will. And I also want to say this. I love me public defenders. I love me some public defenders, but they are not the only candidates. If we look, for example, to attorneys who have worked in the civil context for poor people. In Philly, that would be Community Legal Services. There are similar names elsewhere. If we look to some of the idealistic probation officers, the ones who picked up a law degree, they may be coming with an interesting level of expertise, and you should not rule them out. There are as a lot of you know, there are the probation officers who think that they're cops, and then there's the other group who are more like social workers, and they really are there to try to address the fundamental issues, get at the problem, and prevent future crime. The people you need on the bench are out there. They're just not on the bench. And that means that you need to reach out. You need to pick them. You need to go to them. You need to shake them up. And then you need to reach out to people like me through Netroots or through whatever means and our allies. And then what we will be looking at is not form as sort of a 1.0, a grassroots movement to bring in progressive prosecutors, but this will be more like a 2.0, where voters are able not only to get their will when it comes to progressive prosecutors, but they can get it when it comes to those prosecutors having institutional allies, starting with the judiciary. Final comment, and then I will shut up. So a couple of years ago, I used to walk around bragging that 10% of the United States had elected a progressive prosecutor, and then I was corrected a few weeks ago. In the last 2 years, spanning the period of time around the death of George Floyd, the number has gone from 10% to 20.1%. There are 70 to 75 million Americans who are in a jurisdiction where the chief prosecutor is now progressive. In many instances, they have been reelected, not just elected, but reelected. And in Philadelphia, I'm proud to say, overwhelmingly reelected in the primary with 2/3 of the vote. This is doable. It's entirely doable. It's more about breaking your own beliefs and thoughts about what judges are and going there, seizing that power and becoming it. Not easy. It is difficult in many different ways, but it's something that you can and must do. Thank you.
Sorry, I think thank you so much for joining us, District Attorney Rose, and really hits the nail on the head of what we want to talk about today. So thank you so much for that perspective. So now I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel, and then we'll get started with some questions. I'm going in alphabetical order. I put it this way. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself in any detail. My name is Josie W. Rice. I'm a journalist and writer who focuses on the criminal justice system. But everybody else is more interesting, so we'll go to them. So we have Megan French Marcelin. She serves as the campaign director in criminal justice and democracy at Color of Change, where she oversees a portfolio that includes decarceration, pretrial reform, prosecutor accountability, and fighting voter suppression. Previously, Megan created and led Justice USA's Working Future campaign, a campaign that seeks to dismantle barriers that amount to punishment. Sorry, I'm going to ask everybody to mute if you're not speaking, because it's going to do feedback. A campaign that seeks to dismantle barriers that amount to perpetual punishment for people with conviction records through state legislation and culture-shifting public education. We also have Judge Angel Harris here, elected on November 3rd, 2020 to the Orleans Parish Criminal District Court. She previously served as assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where her advocacy focused on capital defense, juvenile life without the possibility of parole, felon disenfranchisement, and policing reform. Prior to joining LDF, Angel served as a staff attorney with the ACLU's Capital Punishment Project, where she represented death sentence prisoners nationwide. Between 2009 and 2013, she was a public defender in Louisiana, in both Orleans and Calcasieu parishes, and we're former coworkers. So that's the other exciting fact, at least for my bio. We have Christopher Kang, the co-founder and chief counsel of Demand Justice, which is building a progressive movement to restore balance and legitimacy to our nation's courts. Chris served in the Obama White House for nearly 7 years as deputy counsel to President Obama and special assistant to the president for legislative affairs. He oversaw the selection, vetting, and confirmation of more than 220 of the president's judicial nominees who set records for the most people of color, women, and openly gay and lesbian judges appointed by a president. He was also in charge of advising President Obama on commutations and pardons from 2014 to 2015, and helped spearhead the confirmations of Supreme Court Justices Sotomayor and Kagan, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and passage of the Fair Sentencing Act to reduce the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And last but not least, we have Keisha Robinson, who serves as the Deputy Chief for the Prisoner and Reentry Legal Services Program in the DC Public Defender Service Community Defender Division. The Community Defender Division, say that 5 times fast, provides legal advice, social services, and community education and outreach to adults and children who are in the post-adjudication stage of a criminal or juvenile delinquency case arising out of the DC Superior Court. Ms. Robinson manages a team of attorneys who respond to the legal and social services needs of newly released individuals and others with DC criminal records, assisting them in making a successful transition back into the community. Further, she serves as a public defender services liaison to individuals convicted of District of Columbia code offenses who are serving sentences in the DC Department of Corrections, Central Treatment Facility, and Federal Bureau of Prisons by providing legal information to assist these individuals, monitor their conditions of confinement, and provide legal representation in parole, early termination of supervision, and other release-related legal matters. Before joining the CDD, Ms. Robinson was a senior attorney in the Public Defender Services Trial Division, handling serious felonies. Okay, you all have incredible bios. I have a lot of questions for all of you for another time, but I will get started on the questions that matter to this panel. So Chris, I want to start with you. Can you give our panel and the audience a sense of what we're seeing right now as far as the federal judiciary goes, who's being nominated, what it's looking like, and how it compares to, you've obviously been doing this for years and have been watching the federal judiciary for years. How does this compare to what you've seen in the past?
Thanks so much, Josie. I think that there really is no comparison to anything that's happened before. What President Biden is doing, sort of starting in December, his White House counsel sort of told all the Democratic senators, we're going to prioritize professional diversity in a way that it's never been prioritized before, focusing on public defenders, civil rights lawyers, legal aid lawyers, and other lawyers who represented individuals, right? So trying to contrast this from prosecutors and corporate lawyers who represented institutions. And in particular, the focus has been on public defenders. President Biden has nominated 51 judges so far. 17 of them have been former public defenders, so 1 out of 3. And like that is an order of magnitude different from anything we've ever seen. And so, as you mentioned, I ran judicial nominations for President Obama for a majority of his presidency. And I could defend his record. For example, one of the talking points we often used was President Obama appointed more circuit court judges, so the level just below the Supreme Court, more circuit court judges with experience in public defense than all other presidents in history combined, which sounds really impressive until you realize the number was 5, which was more than the 3 of any president before. But also, like President Biden now, the Senate sometime maybe even this week, is going to confirm his 5th circuit court judge with experience in public defense. He's already matched that record, that historic record, 9 months in. And I think that this sort of shows that how much this has changed and how important the leadership is in terms of setting the agenda, setting the priority, and then making sure that that senators and others are able to see it through.
Yeah, absolutely. That's remarkable statistic, both depressing on how it used to be and good, hopeful on what it could look like going forward. So I'm going to move to you, Judge Harris. So you obviously have a history both in public defense and policy work, in looking at the criminal justice system from a critical eye in many different ways. And then you decided to run for judge and won, and have already had just a major impact in your role as judge in New Orleans. So can you talk a little bit about how your experience as a judge has been informed by your experience as a public defender and your previous work, and how you think do you think it's made you a better judge? You think, how do you actually think that it's qualitatively affected your work?
All right. Well, first off, I'm excited to be on this panel. Everyone on the panel is amazing. It's interesting because we're in October. I was elected last November, and so coming up on 10 months on the bench, and it sometimes it's a surreal experience. But I do think that my being a public defender definitely informs first of all, how I interact with individuals who come into my courtroom. And that to me was one of the most important things, because as a public defender, I saw my clients being dehumanized and being disrespected on a daily basis. And I vowed that that would not happen in my court. Additionally, I decided to run against an incumbent, which hadn't been done in Orleans Parish, or an incumbent hadn't been beat in Orleans Parish since the 1970s in criminal court. And so folks looked at me like I was crazy. So not only was I a public defender trying to take the bench, I was trying to knock out someone who was already on the bench. So bold move, right? But I knew that things needed to change in the criminal court system, because as a public defender, as I said, I was in court every day and I saw the injustices that were happening to my clients. But also as someone who did policy work and who did systemic change, with my work at LDF, that was something that I think also informs me on the bench, because I have seen what can go wrong in a courtroom. But also, and Mr. Krasner talked about this a little bit, when you have someone who has a criminal defense background on the bench, we look at cases very differently. So when I look at a case file, I'm not looking at it the same way that someone who maybe has a prosecutorial background has. I've dealt with individuals who have mental health issues. I've dealt with individuals who are battling with addiction, and I am able to view them in a very different way. And I can work with counsel in figuring out the best way to address those underlying issues. And I think that's what I bring to the bench, is really looking at and trying to deal with the underlying issues, so we can ensure that we are creating safer and healthier communities by what happens in my courtroom.
Thank you so much. That 1970 statistic is unbelievable. I did not realize that before today. And I'm very glad you're on the bench, and thank you so much for that insight. So I wanted to ask you, Keisha, about your experience as a public defender currently and working with public defenders and managing them. And you obviously interact with the judiciary in a number of sort of different ways in your various roles. I think you have 8 jobs from what I just read from your bio. And so can you talk about, as someone who's on the other side of this work, what the actual difference is to have a judge who seems to recognize the humanity, regardless of their background, I guess, seems to recognize the humanity in your clients, versus what the real impact it has on your clients when you have a different kind of judge. I think people think of judges as balls and strikes, right? As Judge Roberts is famous for saying, and it's obviously they have much more of an impact than that. So I think it's important for people to understand from your perspective what that looks like. And I just want to say, if you are in this session and you have questions, please ask them on the in the chat. I will get to them with about 15 minutes to go, and I'd love to ask this panel any questions you have. So please send them in. Anyway, Keisha, go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josie. First of all, thank you for having me on this panel. I feel like I've won the lottery being with all my favorite types of people. And also thank you for recognizing my 8 jobs, because no one else seems to salute that. So thank you. Just for that, this panel has fulfilled all my dreams. But no, really, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity. And there is so much on the line. You said, what difference does this make? It makes a huge difference to the clients I've represented, over 1,000 now, over an almost 20-year career. And what it means is when they are talking to me, the public defender, in the cell block, before presentment, before the judge, and they're like, I have to get my daughter from daycare tomorrow morning. I cannot afford to lose this job that it took me 9 months to get. If I get violated on probation, I'm facing lifetime incarceration because I'm on parole. The stakes that are high are literally life and liberty, the thing that I swore to protect, right? And it comes up at every juncture in this job. So when I'm preparing for trial and I'm trying to get a certain jury instruction because my client is explaining to me what the defense is, and it's critical that I get that jury instruction, I want a judge who understands that. When there's been a Brady violation, meaning the government has withheld information, I need a judge that understands that that's a possibility and even likely probable and doesn't just dismiss it outright. It means for my clients who have served 20, 25, 30, 35 years in prison, and they demonstrate that they've rehabilitated themselves, that they've taken every prison program that exists, they've now created new programs because no more exists, that you take that into account when you're reading their compassionate release motion. And you're willing to be brave and courageous and let them out because they've already missed one child's 6th grade graduation, college graduation, marriage, and now they're having their first grandchild. Can I at least be released now? It is literally life and liberty. The thing that our Constitution upholds, that's what's on the line. I want to say one thing. For many of my colleagues, I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room. They say, I am a public defender. I'm the idealist that Larry Krasner talked about. I can't put someone in jail. I can't put someone in prison. That can't be me. My challenge to them is, but you can be the person who frees them. You can be the person that lets them out. You can be the person that says, I'm going to do it differently, like Larry Krasner did, who reduced the prison population by 30% in Philadelphia, like Chesa in San Francisco, who got rid of cash bail. You can completely bring a new perspective that challenges the premise, that challenges how we've always done it. So this is our time. This is our opportunity. It's no longer in theory. And I hope that everyone who hears this stands up and says, sign me up. I want to be that person that makes a real change for our clients and not just a person who's begging for the change.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely right. Thank you so much for that insight. So Megan, I want to ask you about how to bridge the gap between what the public, what seems approachable to the public and what experts and lawyers know. So I think the movement around prosecutors has been relatively successful in part because it has allowed people. It's a much more tangible thing, I think, for people than judges are. You can sort of explain the impact they have on the system in a different way that I think resonates with people more intensely than when you talk about the judiciary. I mean, we see, I want to ask Angel about this as well, but we see a lot of impact that judicial elections have, but we still know that it takes a lot to kind of get people motivated to show up for them. So at Color of Change, where your work is really campaigns and movement building, how do you think about stuff like, getting more public defenders on the judiciary, something that might seem kind of pie in the sky to someone who isn't doing this work every single day?
Yeah, thank you so much, Josie. And going last has just tapped right into my imposter syndrome with this panel because everyone is just so fantastic. But I think it's really interesting to think about because 5 years ago there was no prosecutor accountability movement that was taking off in the way that Larry Krasner talked about it. 5 years ago, the idea that you could elect a reform prosecutor, which is the word that I prefer because progressive prosecutor is a bit of a misnomer, was not really on the table. And I think what has been really interesting is to watch not just organizations like Color of Change, but grassroots organizations take on the issue of prosecutors, understanding that whether you're trying to reform the system or abolish the system, it is a major part of harm reduction. And I want to just I think I'm going to give an example of some of the work that's happening in California around judges, because I think it speaks to the ability to transform that narrative and make it accessible and palatable to people. Because as we know, like we have to inch our way through these things. So Humphrey was passed last year, I think, or was decided last year. It was a Supreme Court case in California where the Supreme Court said that they believed that the bail system of California violated due process and equal protection rights, and that cash bail had to be set only at an ability to pay. And it was a remarkable transformation in what we were seeing. Now, of course, what happened after that is exactly what we expected. Judges have been routinely bumping, just ignoring Humphreys altogether. And so there has been a group on the ground of organizations, Color of Change is part of it, Dignity and Power Now, La Defensa, the Public Defenders of San Francisco, who have been working to build out that messaging that is like, this is part of how we transform the system. And we transform the system by ensuring that there is judicial accountability, that there are penalties when a judge doesn't follow Humphreys, that there are ways of holding. I think part of the reason judges feel so scary to people is because it's like the Wizard of Oz. No one knows how those decisions get made. And so I think the work that's being done in California right now has been to begin to educate people and pull that curtain down. And just a shout out to La Defensa, who has built this really incredible platform called Rate My Judge. And it allows people to basically, after going through a hearing, put up what's like a Yelp review of their judge. And so they're doing these really, it might feel a little tongue in cheek, but it takes the wonkiness out of the judicial system for people and allows people to really engage with the idea that they have the power to change this. And I think seeing public defenders take on that, for all the reasons that I feel like folks on this panel have mentioned, seeing public defenders become judges, I think would radically transform the bail system overnight. And I think I think that's just one example. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Megan. All of you guys have kind of touched on, well, I'll put it this way. So we're talking about, in some ways, the federal judiciary, right? We're talking about Biden's nomination process and who's actually going to be a federal judge. But often when you work in the criminal justice system, you're dealing with local and state judges, which is a different process, a different system, and a different level of accountability. And I don't think any of us would argue the federal judiciary is that accountable either, but I think it's much more difficult to hold state and local judges accountable. So Judge Harris, I wanted to ask you about the electoral process, because I think what is intimidating to a lot of people is the fear that you run for one of these offices and people say, well, look who you defended, right? Did you encounter that? Do you think about that when you're thinking about making your own decisions? We know that judicial elections tend to make judges more harsh, more brutal in their decision-making because they're worried about backlash from the electorate. How has the role of being an elected judge shaped your decision-making? And how do you think it really shapes your colleagues' decision-making as well?
So interestingly enough, they did not bring up the fact of who I defended, and I did capital work, so that was surprising that actually did not come up. But there were other things that they talked about,
Right. They found their ways, right?
But I guess for me, right, when I came in, I was very clear about where I stood. So there would be no confusion. I had a very concrete platform, and my sort of campaign slogan was about reimagining our criminal court system. So there was no confusion that I had an issue with the way that we were currently doing things on the bench. And I think for me, that made it much easier because it was either you are on board with change or you're not. And so I was very conscious in making sure that I didn't sort of toe the line. But also being very honest and transparent about, what limitations judges have. Because judges do have a lot of discretion, and that was something that I talked about, but our hands are tied in certain situations. If a statute requires a particular thing, then I can't go against that. There are obviously caveats to that. When we're talking about mandatory minimums, you can have what we call here Dorothy hearings and things of that nature, but there are still some things that I can't change. But my entire purpose in running was that there are a lot of things that can be changed and a lot of things we haven't thought about. And it's time to be creative, and that we need people who are willing to be bold enough to say that. There was a slate of public defenders in New Orleans when I was running. And so there was that group of us. So on my campaign, there were other people who were also talking about progressive things. So I think that made it a little easier for me to go into a forum and talk about change and talk about, let's talk about alternatives to incarceration. What are ways that we can actually get to the root cause or those sort of core things that are going on in our communities? But there was also for me, there was no hiding what my background was. I was a public defender. I was a civil rights attorney. It was very clear. I mean, there are op-eds that I've written. My opinion about things were out there. And I think that made it so much easier for me to just be who I was. And so once I got elected, because I was so clear on my platform, there was no reason for me to back down, because I said from the beginning, we're not going to be doing things the way that it's been done. And I went with 64% of the vote. So there was an overwhelming majority that said, this is what we want. And that gave me the courage to, once I got on the bench, to do what I said I was going to do. But also because I was a former public defender, I knew, it wasn't like I was talking about something in a bubble. I had experience in court. I knew what types of cases would be coming in front of me. So it wasn't this sort of idealistic, oh, we're only going to have non-crimes of violence that are going to be in front of us. And that was something that always bothered me, as when we're talking about criminal justice reform, when we only focus on non-crimes of violence. But we have people who are coming into the court. We have to deal with the real issues here. And how are we going to deal with those issues? And so I think, like I said, for me, because from the very beginning, I was very clear about it. Once I got on the bench, I didn't feel the pressure to back down or to sort of fall into what was expected of me, because what was expected of me is everything that I've been doing since I've stepped foot on the bench. And so I think it's important, if someone is going to run, for them to be honest about where they stand on issues, and they will see that there are people who will support them, because it's time for us to change the way that we're doing things. And the only way we can do that is if we are sincere in our campaign promises.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you kind of about what Judge Harris just said, Chris, about on the federal level. When public defenders are nominated, what is the backlash they face from a different kind of critical body, right, which is Congress, versus what Judge Harris is saying that she experienced with the electorate? Is there kind of a different sense of the backlash? And the idea of being honest about where you stand and how you does that have the same value, do you think, on the federal judicial process as it does on a local one? In other words, is it, or are we still seeing kind of the need to to pretend as if in every decision you make is not informed at all by your previous experience, but is made kind of an isolation?
So I think that's a great question, because there definitely are differences between state and local judges and federal, including the process. Obviously, you're not running and you don't have sort of a campaign platform. All of that is different. I think that the things that are commonly true are that I think state and local courts are probably even more out of balance than the federal courts. So we need to have balance. But then also, as DA Krasner said, we have to break free of our own thoughts and beliefs on what a judge is. Right. And I think that is true from public defenders and civil rights lawyers, raising their hands to even want to be considered. I think, when I was interviewing potential judicial candidates during the Obama administration, I would ask them, why do you want to be a judge and why are you applying now? And disproportionately, women and people of color and LGBTQ lawyers, they would say, I'm applying now because somebody encouraged me to, or often more than one person encouraged them to. A judge, a supervisor, even opposing counsel. Bluntly, straight white men would say, well, this is something I've been thinking about since my 1L con law class, or since I read To Kill a Mockingbird in high school, right? It's just a different view, partly because of role modeling and sort of the signals that we're sending about who judges are. And when we think about the legal profession, if judges are the pinnacle of our legal profession, and they're dominated by corporate law partners and prosecutors, you're sort of training a whole generation, every young lawyer, into these different legal positions, and not sort of toward service, and not toward serving individuals, and not sort of protecting the constitutional rights of everybody from that perspective. And so we have to break free and sort of encourage more people, and hopefully encourage more public defenders to see for themselves why they can be judges and how they can still fight for, preserving, at the end of the day, they're still, as judges, preserving the values of equality and justice and the Constitution, just from a different vantage point. But then I think the other thing that is sort of common are some of the concerns that you get, right? In the Senate Judiciary Committee, we've already seen Republicans complain about public defenders not being fair, or not having enough experience or enough range of experience, sort of the kind of criticism that they never lodge against prosecutors. Suddenly career public defenders don't have enough experience because they only do criminal law. But prosecutors are fine. Career prosecutors are fine. So there's some of these stereotypes that we have to break through. And then finally, I think the one commonality here, and really why I think this is a great program that sort of spans this entire spectrum of the courts, is we need more people to care, right? We need more people to care about having judges, whether it's elected at the state or local level, or whether they're nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, to understand why this balance is so important and why they need to get engaged, because it really is part of an overall theory of how we're going to affect change.
And Josie, can I just add one other thing?
Absolutely, please.
So one of the things too that I found interesting when I was running was a lot of people. So I also chose to campaign in places where people typically don't campaign. So I was in neighborhoods that aren't typically on the list to go canvass, because it's based on voter participation. And while I was out, it was surprising to me how many people didn't know that you actually elected the judges on the local bench. And so I think for folks who are interested in sort of thinking about running on a local level, there is an audience that has not been tapped into that is very much interested in changing things. And so we have to, one, it's been stated several times now, believe ourselves that we can do it. But there are people who are just waiting for someone to step up and take up that role, and they will be more than happy to support you. And that's what I found along the campaign trail. When I talk to people on the street corners, when I talk to people at bus stops, when I talk to people at barbershops, those were the people that became ignited and they wanted change. And those were the people that supported me through this. And so I think people are waiting for like-minded folks to step up and run. And I think you will find much more support than you think you will. And also, we have to stop looking for the sort of typical people who generally are the sort of gatekeepers. It's time to engage the community, the people who are directly impacted by our court system. And I think they are ready to support folks who have diverse backgrounds to be on the bench, particularly local benches.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to remind everybody, if you have questions, to please send them in just a few minutes. We're going to open it up for questions. But I did want to ask a question to all of you about accountability. So right now we're talking about, how do you get someone on the bench, right? How do you get someone confirmed? How do you have someone win the election? Like that's process number one. But there is another element here, which is then someone's on the bench for anywhere between a couple of years to a lifetime, and are making decisions in ways that impact people's lives. And they don't always, they're very rarely held accountable, in part because there's not always accessible infrastructure for knowing what decisions they're making, right? So some of this is a journalism problem, some of it's a media problem, some of it's an access problem, but all of it really contributes to the fact that judges don't always feel immediately accountable to the electorate or to the people that they serve. And I'm wondering from all of you, from everybody from an actual judge to someone who does campaigns, how do we ensure that judges are more accountable? I mentioned earlier that there have been all these studies done about how judicial elections often make judges more harsh right before the election because they're scared about whatever, letting the wrong person out and then paying for that in some ad somewhere. And I know that, with judges like Judge Harris, we don't have that concern, but there are many judges on the bench right now that we could be doing a better job of holding accountable. What does that accountability look like? And how do you all think of it? So I'll start with you, Keisha, and then we'll go around.
I think all questions like that, I'm reminded of law school. It depends on the jurisdiction, right? I mean, but it's really an all of the above strategy. Be your mission in life, all of the above strategy. You're doing all things simultaneously, right? So one way is, I like what Judge Harris said about going to the people, right? The people hold the levers. It's the people who elect the politicians who pass the law. Now you may say, oh, Keisha, that sounds great. That sounds like a civics course. No, I'm serious. In the District of Columbia, because of the power of the people and our advocacy and various stakeholders and that constant pressure and engagement with our city council, we have passed major legislation in the last 2 years alone on good time credits, increasing them, compassionate release, making it a relief mechanism, second look, game changer, literally a legal mechanism for decarceration, not just decarceration in theory. We, the people, through our representatives, decide your honor, what you should be looking at, right? What the test is, what the factors are. And when applying those, people are more likely to get released. And if you don't, we have an appeals process. There's the accountability, right? And so passing lots of laws that are changing the game on what judges can do makes a difference. Also, I do believe that people change over time. We've seen that with George Floyd, actual changes in the courtroom. I remember the first time I was doing a closing and I brought up the word race, and the judge was like, objecting, he's the judge. Miss Robinson, why are you talking about race? Because it's relevant, because it matters. He's like, just don't. Now it's 2021. We could talk about race all day long, right? That judge is still on the bench. So there's a lot of mechanisms. I know that's not a perfect answer, but I believe I'm all about empowering people, empowering us, and empowering our clients. When I talk about the people who make the change, the people who have the most impact are clients who testify before the DC Council, in my experience, right? Clients who are saying what their needs are. Clients who are saying how your sentence impacted my life. And people can change, and I've seen it happen. So that's one mechanism.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Keisha. Does anybody else, I'd like to hear from all of you on this about how you think about accountability. So we can go to you, Megan, but we'll also give people in the message, people are messaging asking for sort of hints of what to do next, and we can provide those as well. So Megan, do you want to talk about how you think about accountability when it comes to judges in particular?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons learned from the prosecutor accountability work, right? We have seen what it means to put someone in office and recognize that one, the level to which they can make change with line prosecutors who have been there for ages and ages is tempered, but also that like just putting someone in office doesn't mean change is on the horizon. And I think I would say there are two things that I think are really critical. And this is we worked really closely in Orleans Parish with a group of local organizations. Shout out to Shannon, who's in the chat right now, and really helped with a lot of this work. But bringing in directly impacted people into those conversations to shape the platform that the people put forth for the new DA. And I think one of the things that we have been able to do with DA Williams in New Orleans is the day he took office, we asked for 5 days on each calendar year that he was in office, where he would hold public accountability forums. And the terms of those were, they're going to be 75 minutes. You will have 5 minutes to talk at the beginning, and we will give you the topics, but not the questions. And if we don't like your answer, we're going to send you a letter afterwards. And I think it's, when you're trying to hold someone accountable, it's really hard to balance, like, do you publicly blast them, or do you stick to inside strategies? And I think what's been effective there has been that people have gotten to ask the questions of the DA, of what he's doing, why he's not doing certain things, why certain processes have just melted away. And that there's no value judgment there. And then I think the other thing is we have to get rid of judicial immunity. Like, we have to be in a place where judges can be sued and judges can be held liable for the choices that they're making. And I think until we begin to address that and frankly make that going back to make that an issue that people really understand and see as vital to preserving any sense of justice, we won't get anywhere.
Chris or Angel, do either of you want to talk about accountability?
Just say, like, on the federal level, to the extent that the only way to truly hold a federal judge accountable is to impeach and remove them, the accountability is a little bit harder to achieve. But I would suggest there's a different level of accountability or a different place where we should think about accountability, and that's United States senators, right? And not just because they vote to confirm all of these federal judges, but, as great as President Biden's picks have been on professional diversity, it's also the result in a lot of these cases because Democratic senators have made these recommendations. Democratic senators are often the ones that create the pool from which President Biden makes suggestions or makes his nominations. And so, again, the leadership comes from the top. Without President Biden saying, I want more public defenders and civil rights lawyers, senators are not likely to recommend them on their own. But now we also see not every senator is following through on this new Biden model. Some of them are still reverting back to nominating prosecutors and corporate lawyers. And we have to make sure that we're holding senators accountable for their recommendations. But then also, when you have senators making recommendations of the first public defenders in their courts in decades or in history, whether it's, Minnesota or New Mexico or Connecticut or Georgia, sort of when these senators do the right thing, sort of making sure that they feel appreciated for doing the right thing so that we can encourage them to continue doing so in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll be brief on the accountability. I said while I was campaigning, if I encourage everyone to come and visit court and because you need to see what judges are doing. A lot of people, unless they have a loved one who has a case or unless they have a case themselves, don't come into the criminal court building. So they have no idea what judges are actually doing. And the only time you really hear about judges is if they make the newspaper for some particular thing. And that's usually going to be something really terrible or something really great. And so I think having groups in New Orleans, we have Court Watch NOLA. So there are community volunteers who come in and watch court proceedings. They have a rubric on what they are looking at. And so there's a standard way of sort of reviewing, and then they publish a report every year. And so that's a way of showing accountability. Courtrooms are open to everyone. I know with COVID, it makes it a little more difficult, but we allow Zoom court. I allow anyone to come in and observe my court because I want to make sure that I am continuing to live up to what I said I was going to do on the bench. And I want community members to feel comfortable enough to watch me and see what's happening because what I do impacts them. I did see, and I know we're kind of running out of time, there was someone who asked a question, is there an ideal practice for getting judges on the bench?
That's what I was going to ask next, so perfect.
So I would say, and I say this with a grain of salt because I think my situation wasn't typical, right? My opponent, who I stated before, it was an incumbent, raised probably 4 or 5 times more, if not more money than I did. He received all of the major endorsements except maybe 2 or 3. And so when we're talking about sort of I talked about this before, the gatekeepers and getting the major endorsements, he got all of that. So on paper, he should have won that election when you look at what the typical things are that get someone on the bench. But what I did was I knew that I was going to run a race that was based on the community and it was based on directly impacted individuals. So it didn't matter to me what major endorsement he received. I knew that every day I was talking to individuals and I was creating relationships with folks. And that is what got me elected. It was hard work. It wasn't given to me in any type of way. And I had to, and it was interesting because a lot of people would talk about, oh, well, you don't have this endorsement, you don't have that. And there were people who publicly would not support me because they were afraid to go against an incumbent. And so you just have to be creative and find your strategies. But when we're talking about change, it's time to change everything, the entire way that we elect people in general, whether it's judges or senators or Congress people. It's just time to change our political system.
Josie, can I say one thing for 10 seconds?
Yeah.
It's important that everyone remembers that we're talking about carceral systems, not just the criminal legal system. So when we have new types of judges, that affects the dependency system, delinquency system, immigration court, housing court, reentry matters, education. So that's how we make major change. Just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Okay, so we are just at time. I was gonna ask some more questions and then realized you guys are too interesting and we have hit our time limit. But I did want to give each of you just about 10 seconds, really try to stick to that if you can, to tell the audience what they can do, if there's a website they can go to, if there's if they can do anything to support your work, to let them know. I'm gonna, whoever wants to, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but if you do, now is a good time to make it, give people the connections to the work that you're doing.
I would like to plug BPDA, which stands for the Black Public Defender Association. We're doing amazing work. This is a major issue for us, along with policy work. Go to our website, go to Facebook, join us, and also read our report on decarceration.
Chris, you want to go?
Sure. We're at demandjustice.org or follow us on Twitter at WeDemandJustice and learn how to plug in. Thanks.
Megan?
You can follow Color of Change at colorofchange.org. And I really suggest you look at La Defensa's Rate My Judge, LA. I think that's the...
Great, thank you.
I did my spiel, but if folks do want to connect, you can email me at aharris@criminalcourt.org. I'm happy to talk with anybody who is interested in running for local judicial positions. I am happy to strategize, talk about talking points. I would love to be a resource for anyone because I've been through the process now, so.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks for taking the time out of your day. This was super interesting and gave me a lot of hope for what the future looks like. So thank you so much for your work. And I hope everybody enjoyed the panel.
Thank you. Thank you for doing a great job moderating.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.